Hello everyone, welcome back. Today we're going to be going over our lecture on the respiratory tract, which is chapter 35 of your book. These are your learning objectives. List the generalized functions of the respiratory system. List and locate the organs of the respiratory system. Identify, describe, and correlate the anatomy of the nose with its specialized functions. List the anatomical divisions of the pharynx, the openings into and between its divisions and its functions. And last but not least, list the anatomical divisions, cartilages, and muscles of the larynx. Alright, so we're going to start with structures and functions of the respiratory system. So our respiratory system is divided into two main parts. We have the upper respiratory tract and also the lower respiratory tract. The upper tract includes the nose, the nasopharynx, the oropharynx, laryngopharynx, and the larynx. And these structures are primarily responsible for filtering, warming, and also humidifying the air that we breathe in. The lower respiratory tract consists of the trachea, the bronchial trees, the lungs, and these are primarily structures where gas exchange occurs. We also have some accessory structures, and these are structures such as our diaphragm and our intercostal muscles. So they basically assist us with breathing as well. So some of the key functions of the respiratory system include air distribution, gas exchange, and also air filtration. So in terms of cellular respiration, that occurs basically at the tissue level. So that's where O2 is converted into the energy that we need through metallic processes. All right, again, this cellular respiration gives us the energy that our bodies need to function. All right, so this is a visual of both the upper and lower tract. So as mentioned earlier, the upper tract consists of the nasal cavity, which is here. It also consists of the pharynx, which as you can see is broken down into the different sections that we mentioned, and also the larynx. Right, and all of these function as an entryway for air and also passage of that air to our lungs. All right, the lower tract includes the trachea, which is here, the bronchi, bronchioles, and alveoli as well. All right, so the bronchi, the bronchioles, and the alveoli, all right, as you can see, the lower tract. All right, and all of these provide a location for oxygen exchange to occur. All right, so the alveoli are really important structures for us. Again, that's where O2 or oxygen that we inhale is going to diffuse into our bloodstream, and CO2 is going to be expelled. When we talk about diffuse, it's basically going to move from the alveoli to the capillaries to enter the bloodstream. And of course, carbon dioxide is going to be expelled. All right, the branching structures of the bronchial trees, all right, as you can see here, the bronchial trees, they basically help increase what we call the surface area, so make more area for gas to be exchanged efficiently. All right, the respiratory system itself works closely with the circulatory system that we learned about, and again, its job is to deliver oxygen to our tissues and remove carbon dioxide from the body. All right, so now we're going to look at the structure of our nose. So the nose is an important part of the respiratory system as well, and because that is our main entryway for air. All right, it has two main sections. It has the external portion, or the part that we see, and it also has the internal portion called the nasal cavity. All right, the external portion or the outer part of the nose, it's made of bone and also cartilage. And of course, it's covered by our skin. And the skin basically contains what we call sebaceous glands. And those glands are there to help the skin of that area stay moisturized. All right, we also have two nasal bones that meet at the top, and they connect to what we call the frontal bone. All right, the frontal bone is a bone of the skull, basically helps form our forehead. All right, so they connect to the frontal bone, forming the root of our nose. All right, and the maxilla, which is our upper jaw, it surrounds the base of our nose to give it support. All right, the internal portion or the nasal cavity inside the nose, that's a space where air filtration, the warming of the air, and also the humidification of the air that we breathe in occurs. All right, after that, we have the palatine bones. All right, those separate the nasal cavity from the mouth cavity. So one condition that you could be born with is a condition called a cleft palate, and it's a condition where that palatine bone doesn't completely close during development. All right, so for a baby that's born with a cleft palate, they can have difficulty swallowing and also difficulty speaking as well. All right, now we're moving on to the cribriform plate. So we're still talking about the structure of the nose or how the nose is formed. All right, the cribriform plate, that's a thin structure that separates the nasal cavity from the brain or from the cranial cavity. So it's part of what we call the ethmoid bone, which is a bone of the skull. So again, it's a part of the ethmoid bone that helps support the nose, and it also allows for nerves that are related to our sense of smell to pass through. All right, next we have the nasal septum. All right, and the nasal septum divides the nasal cavity into two parts. So basically the right half and the left half. And it's made up of four main structures, which are listed here. All right, these are the four main structures. So we have the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone. So that's the upper portion of the septum. We have the vomer, which is like a flat bone that forms the lower part of the septum. We have the vomeral nasal cartilages, which are small structures that help support this septum. And we also have the septal nasal cartilage, which is it's flexible. It's cartilage, of course, and it gives our nose not only its shape, but it allows for the sharp, slight movement of your nose. All right, so if you can touch your nose and wiggle it from the left to the right or move it up and down, that is what gives it, the septal nasal cartilage is what gives it the ability to move. So basically, the key takeaway regarding these inner structures of the nose is they're there to help support not only the breathing portion, but also our sense of smell. The cribriform plate, it protects the brain, and it also allows those nerves related to smell to pass through. And the nasal septum ensures that air flows easily through both nostrils. All right, because typically it's going to be divided evenly or equally, unless of course we have what we call a deviated septum. All right, so here's a visual of the nose. Specifically, we're going to be introducing the nasal septum and some of the other structures that we talked about. So as we stated earlier, the septum divides the nose into right and left halves. So we can't really see it here because this is just a cross section of it, but the septum itself would divide the nose into right and left halves. As we stated earlier, it's made up of bone and cartilage, and that's what provides our nose with not only the support that we need, but also with that flexibility. So some of the key structures that we can see here in this picture are going to be the frontal sinus, which is here. And the frontal sinus, the sinuses in general, they lighten the skull, but for this frontal one, it's a hollow space in the skull right above the nose, and it helps with mucus production. All right, next we have the cribriform plate, which is right here. Again, that's part of the ethmoid bone of the skull, and it separates the nasal cavity from the brain and allows for the olfactory nerves, so basically those nerves that are responsible for smell, to pass through. All right, and our brain, of course, would be back here. So as you can see, this cribriform plate separates the nasal cavity from the portion of the skull that would hold our brain. All right, next we have the nasal bone, and these are small bones at the bridge of our nose that connect to the frontal bone. All right, and as you can see, kind of like a fingernail almost. It's a really small bone, and of course the frontal bone would be here. We only see just a little portion of it, and it's a bone in the skull as well. All right, the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid bone, that's a long, thin bone that helps form the upper part of the nasal septum. All right, and then we also have, and that's here, we also have the septal cartilage. All right, that's your considered to be a flexible cartilage that forms the front part of the nasal septum, allowing for the nose to be slightly movable. All right, and then we have the on the septal cartilage is right here. Then we have the vomer. All right, and the vomer is a small flat bone that forms the lower part of the septum, which is here. All right, and then we have the vomeronasal cartilage, which is a small piece of cartilage near the vomer that helps support the nasal septum. All right, and that's here. Then we have our maxilla, which we can't really see it because we don't have, you know, the whole skull here, but the maxilla and the palatine bone, which are bones of our face or slash skull, they help form the floor of our nasal cavity, all right, and it separates it from our mouth. All right, so that is pretty much it. Again, these things are going to be not only essential for us to breathe properly, but also it helps ensure that air is moving evenly through both nostrils. And it's also said to play a role in our smell and also voice resonance. So basically the way that we speak. Or now we're moving on to passageways of our nasal cavity. So the nasal cavity has three major passages, and we call those meatuses. All right, and they help direct the flow of air as it enters our nose. All right, so we have the superior meatus. It's the highest passageway. It's near the top of the nasal cavity. We have the middle meatus. It's the middle passageway that connects to the sinuses. And we also have the inferior meatus. It's the lowest passageway that's closest to the floor of the nasal cavity. So these passageways, not only do they help filter the air that we breathe in, it also helps warm and humidify that air as well before it enters our lungs. So the meatuses, you know, they basically increase the surface area inside of the nose to improve not only health air filtration, but also our sense of smell. So in terms of how air moves through the nose, it enters the nostrils. We call those the anterior nares. It passes into the vestibule, basically the front part of the nasal cavity that has small hairs called cilia. All right, and cilia are going to be responsible for helping to filter not only dust but also particles that enter. All right, that air then moves through all three meatuses at the same time, and finally the air is going to travel um, to the posterior nares, which lead to the pharynx. All right, and then it'll go from there down into our lungs. All right, now we're moving on to the nasal mucosa and the paranasal sinuses. All right, so the nasal mucosa and also the paranasal sinuses are important because they basically, in addition to helping with breathing, they also help filter the air, and they also help with our sense of smell as well. So the nasal mucosa is lined with what we call respiratory mucosa, and that's basically moist tissue that traps dust, bacteria, and other particles that enter before they can enter our lungs, enter the nose before it can enter our lungs. The paranasal sinuses, we do have 4 pair of them. They are air-filled spaces inside of the skull, and they connect to the nasal cavity. So each sinus is also lined with what we call a respiratory mucosa. So just like the nasal cavity, um, this mucosa also is going to help the airway to stay clear and moist as well. All right, this is a microscopic view of respiratory mucosa. So it acts, I'll say, like a filter to clean up the air that we breathe in. It also keeps the nasal passages um, and the airway moist and protected from infections. The cilia that we see here, as well as the mucus, they're going to work together to remove those harmful particles, preventing them from reaching our lungs. All right, so the respiratory mucosa is the lining inside of the nasal cavity and also the airway, and it's made up of what we call pseudo-stratified ciliated columnar epithelium, and that's a type of tissue with special structures that trap and remove dust, bacteria, and also other particles. All right, and that's what we're talking about right here, and you can see the cilia right here. We also have goblet cells. All right, goblet cells. And these goblet cells, they produce mucus. So the job of the mucus is to trap the dust, bacteria, and other particles before they can enter the lungs. Last but not least, as you can see the cilia up here, that's the tiny hair-like structures that move in I'll say a wave-like motion to push mucus and also trap particles out of the airways. So overall, this respiratory mucosa, again, is going to act like a filter. It keeps the nasal passages and the airways moist and protect it from infections. And the cilia and mucus also work together to remove any harmful particles that do enter, preventing them from reaching our lungs. All right, next we have the paranasal sinuses. All right, they are air-filled spaces inside of the bones of the skull. They're also lined with that respiratory mucosa, so just like the nasal cavity, they help with breathing, speech, and also they help with our facial structure. So the frontal sinus is located in the forehead, all right, as you can see. All right, located in the forehead. The maxillary sinus, which is the largest sinus, is located in the cheekbones, as you can see right there. Here's the maxillary sinuses. The sphenoid sinuses are found behind the nasal cavity near the brain, as you can see here in this area. We can kind of see here on this lateral view right here as well. And then, of course, we have the ethmoid sinuses, or near the ethmoid. We have ethmoid air cells here, and they are basically located between the eyes. All right, their job is basically to produce mucus, trap dust and germs, and also humidify and warm our air. All right. All right, now we're moving on to structures and functions of the pharynx and also the pharyngeal tonsils. All right, so the pharynx, that's a tube, I'll say a tube-like structure that connects the nasal cavity and the mouth to the esophagus and the larynx. So it helps us with breathing as well as digestion. It also directs air to the lungs and it directs food to our stomach. So parts of the pharynx are the nasopharynx, that's the uppermost portion right behind the nose. It contains what we call pharyngeal tonsils. All right, if they ever become swollen, they call them adenoids. Adenoids. We also have the oropharynx. That's the middle section, so that's behind the mouth. And it contains two sets of tonsils. We also have the palatine tonsils, and they're basically located on both sides of the throat. And we also have the lingual tonsils that are located at the base of our tongue. All right, the laryngopharynx is the lower section of the pharynx, and that leads to the esophagus and also the larynx. So air then continues to the trachea, which is our windpipe, while food moves into our esophagus. So one thing to note about pharyngeal tonsils, they are composed of lymphatic tissue, and we talked about that when we went over the lymph section. All right, the nasopharynx location basically helps trap bacteria and also viruses that might enter through the nose. So again, when they become swollen, it makes it very difficult for us to breathe. And again, we said that if they ever become swollen, the pharyngeal tonsils, we call them adenoids. We're going to move on to the location and the structure of the larynx. So the larynx is another part of our respiratory system. Some people call it the voice box because it helps with the sounds that we produce. So in terms of location, the larynx is located between the root of the tongue and the top of the trachea. Another name for trachea is our windpipe. So it basically acts like the passageway for the air traveling from our throat into our lungs. In terms of its structure, the larynx is made up of cartilage, which is flexible, but even though it's flexible, it's a very strong tissue. The cartilage pieces are held together by muscles, and they're also connected to other structures that are nearby that allow for movement. All right, the inside of the larynx is lined with ciliated respiratory mucosa. So that's a special type of tissue. Again, the tissue has hair-like structures called cilia, and they're going to help trap and move particles out of our airway. The larynx also is said to contain two sets of folds. We have vestibular folds, which are the upper folds. They don't produce sound, but they do help protect our vocal cords. And then we have the vocal folds. Those are the lower folds, and they're responsible for creating the sounds that we make when air passes through the vocal folds. The vestibule is the space that's located above the vestibular fold. So this is like an entryway or entrance area for the larynx before the air passes through to the vocal cords. All right, so if you're ever hoarse or ever wondered why you might have sore throat or why you might be hoarse, that's because the vocal folds area becomes swollen and irritated, and it does affect how they vibrate when they're swollen and irritated. So basically, to wrap this up, the larynx is not just for breathing, it's also for talking, it's also for singing if you like to sing, and it's also for preventing food from entering our airway. So now we're moving into the laryngeal cartilages. Again, the larynx itself is made up of several cartilages that provide not only the structure for it, but also its function. So the cartilages basically help protect our airway. They support our vocal cords, and they also allow movement during breathing and also times when we're speaking, so speech. All right, so some of the key structures of the cartilage are, the first one is the epiglottis. So in terms of its shape, it's kind of leaf shaped, and it is a piece of cartilage, and it acts kind of like a lid or a top for the larynx. So basically, when we're swallowing food, the lid closes and redirects the food to the proper location. So it prevents food and liquid from entering our airway when we swallow. If you've ever gotten choked while you were drinking or eating, it's because the epiglottis didn't close off the airway properly, and you might have gotten some food, aspirated some food or liquid into your airway. All right, next is the hyoid bone. So it's not actually a cartilage, but it is an important structure because it does support our tongue and also the larynx. It's the only bone in the body that doesn't connect to another bone. All right, next we have the thyroid cartilage, all right, which is here. And the thyroid cartilage, that's the largest cartilage of the larynx. It forms the laryngeal prominence, which is what we call the Adam's apple. All right, and Adam's apple is more prominent in males, and that's more so due to hormones influence the size. We also have the superior thyroid notch. All right, and the superior thyroid notch is just a small dip at the top of the thyroid cartilage. It is an important attachment though for ligaments and also muscles. Then we have the thyroid ligament, which connects the thyroid cartilage to the hyoid bone. All right, so the superior thyroid notch is here, and then the ligament is here. And that also provides for that flexibility during movement that we need when we're swallowing and also speaking. All right, then we have the cricothyroid ligament. All right, and the cricothyroid ligament is here. All right, that connects to the thyroid cartilage. Connects the thyroid cartilage to the cricoid cartilage. All right, which is here. The reason why this portion is kind of important, if you've ever seen on TV those medical emergencies, we call it a cricothyrotomy, basically providing that airway when the person cannot breathe, where they typically in the movies it's like they stab it with a pin or they cut it and put a straw in it, something like that. That is the area where the incision is made. All right, so in this area. All right, next we have the cricoid cartilage. All right, cricoid cartilage is there. It's ring in terms of its shape, and it's right below the thyroid cartilage. All right, it's the only cartilage in the larynx that forms what we call a complete ring, and it's giving it a little bit extra support. All right, now we have the tracheal cartilage, which is down here. And the tracheal cartilage is a series of, we can call them C-shaped cartilages, and they basically keep our trachea, which is our windpipe, they help keep it open. So these rings basically prevent the trachea from collapsing, but it also allows for it to have flexibility and also movement. All right, and then as you can see right here, on the lateral borders, we have the thyroid gland. All right, and that gland sits in front of our trachea, which is again our windpipe, and it produces hormones for us that regulate our energy levels, our metabolism, and also growth. So key takeaways here, these are just structures specifically looking at that laryngeal cartilage structure. Again, it's needed for protection and movement, also for breathing and speech. The epiglottis prevents food from entering the airway. The thyroid cartilage is considered the largest cartilage, and it forms the Adam's apple. The cricoid cartilage is basically, it forms that complete ring for that extra support and stability. The thyroid gland, again, in terms of, it helps us with that hormone production. So again, when we swallow, if you've ever gotten choked, it's because that epiglottis, which should automatically cover the airway, it didn't cover it, I guess I won't say fast enough, but properly. So therefore we choke on the food or the drink that we swallow. All right, and this is basically why we basically don't, if you didn't know, we can't breathe and swallow at the same time. Okay, so we just took a look at the anterior laryngeal cartilages. Now we're going to take a look at the posterior view. All right, so again, some of these we already looked at, but we'll just say them again. The epiglottis, again, that's that flap-like structure or lid-like structure that covers the airway when we swallow, and that's going to prevent food or liquid from entering the trachea. All right, the hyoid bone, which is right there, that's that U-shaped bone that supports the tongue and also the larynx. It also serves for an attachment site for muscles that control speech and swallowing. Then we have the thyroid ligament, all right, here, and it connects the hyoid bone to the thyroid cartilage, allowing for that flexibility and movement. Then we have the thyroid cartilage right there. That's the largest cartilage of the larynx, also known as the Adam's apple. It's responsible for protecting your vocal cords and also providing structure for your airway. Then we have the cartilage that's it's said to have a horn shape. They're small cartilages that are located on top of the arytenoid cartilages, and they help with movement and also tension of our vocal cords. The arytenoid cartilages, they're considered to be pyramid in shape. They're cartilages at the back of our larynx, and they basically help with opening and closing the vocal cords, which is going to affect voice production or how you speak or how you sound when you speak. All right, the cricoid cartilage is next. Again, it's ring in shape, and it's right below the thyroid cartilage, the only part of the larynx that forms a complete circle, and that's for that extra support. Then you can see the thyroid glands here again. They produce those hormones to regulate growth, metabolism, and also our energy levels. Then we have the parathyroid glands here as well. These are 4 small glands. All right, you can see 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 small glands located at the back of your thyroid gland. They're responsible for regulating calcium levels in our blood. All right, and we need that for nerve and also muscle function. All right, and then we have this membranous part of the trachea, and that's basically the flexible part of the trachea that allows it to expand and also contract when we breathe. All right. So what is responsible for basically like our pitch and higher voice sounds? That's basically these arytenoid cartilages. They basically adjust the tension on our vocal cords, and when they tighten, it makes our voice higher. When they loosen, it makes our voice deeper. All right, this is an image of the larynx. Again, this is our voice box, and it's basically does still have a part in our respiratory system as well. So in terms of breathing, speaking, and also protecting our airway. So this is basically 2 views of the larynx. We have a side view on the left, and then we have a frontal view on the right to basically show you those internal structures that we already talked about. So again, on both slides, you see the epiglottis. Again, that's that flap that closes, that prevents food and liquids from entering our airway, and it automatically covers the trachea when we swallow. All right, you can see the hyoid bone here again, and again, that one, it supports our larynx and tongue. The vestibular folds, you can see those again. Basically, the false folds here, they don't produce sound, but they do help protect what we call the true vocal cords. All right, you have the ventricle here, and the ventricle is a space that's between the false and the true vocal cords. All right, and then we have the vocal cords. All right, the vocal cords are the true vocal cords. Those are the ones that are responsible for producing the sounds that we make when air passes through them. In terms of tension, if they're loose or tight, that's going to determine the pitch and the volume that we produce when we speak. All right, then we have the thyroid cartilage next. That's the largest cartilage of the larynx. Again, forms our Adam's apple in the front of the neck, and it also protects our vocal cords. The cryoid cartilage is next. That's that ring-shaped cartilage that provides the structural support. We have the lumen of the trachea. All right, and the lumen of the trachea is a hollow airway that flows. I won't say that flows, but it's a hollow airway that air flows through to the lungs. All right, then we have the thyroid gland again, and that produces the hormones for energy levels, metabolism, etc. Now on the right, we're looking at the frontal view. The vestibule here, that's the uppermost portion of the vocal cords, or the uppermost cavity right above the vocal cords. It's part of our airway passage. The rima glottidis, that's an opening between the vocal cords that widens or narrows to control our airflow and also our sound. Then we have the vocal ligament and vocalist muscle. All right, vocalist muscle here, vocal ligament here. Those basically help with the tension and movement of the vocal cords. Then we have the muscles. Where are they? Here again, they also help with adjusting the pitch and voice by tightening and relaxing the vocal cords as well. Then we have the infraglottic cavity, which is here. That is the space below the space below the vocal cords that lead to the trachea. And then last but not least, you have the tracheal cartilage, which is, we're talking about those C-shaped rings that keep the trachea open for airflow. All right, so that is it for this slide. All right, so now we're looking at the vocal folds, which are also called the vocal cords. So we already know that they are inside the larynx and they allow us to produce sound. So we have a top photo, which is basically, well, we won't have we have the real image internally of the vocal cords, and then of course we have a labeled diagram. So this is what our vocal cords really look like when they're open and closed, and this of course is a labeled diagram. So again, some of the things that we can see on here, we have the epiglottis, which is the flap that covers the airway when we're swallowing, preventing that food from entering our trachea, food and liquids. Then we have the rima glottidis. That's that space between the vocal cords where air passes through to create sound. The size of this opening also changes as the folds are moving. All right, the vestibular folds, all right, here, these are our false vocal cords. So they're located right above the true vocal cords. So they don't produce sound, but they do help protect the vocal cords, and they also assist in closing that airway when we need it to be closed. All right, then we have the cuneiform and the corniculate cartilages. Those are cartilages that help provide structural support for the larynx, and they also help the vocal fold move as well. All right, and then you have the arytenoid cartilage again that controls the movement of the vocal cords. It allows them to open, it allows them to close, and it also allows for the tension to be adjusted for sound production. Then we have, let's see, that's it for that photo. All right, now in terms of the bottom image, the one on the left, these are vocal cords that are in the open position. All right, so it's allowing air to pass through while we're breathing. So the rima glottis is wide open at this point. All right, on the right, image C, these are vocal cords that are closed. So as if we are so they would basically close when we're speaking or when we're swallowing. They would close. So again, this closing of them helps also generate sound by vibrating air as it's forced through. All right, so one thing that the vocal cords do is they vibrate to help produce sound, and their positioning in terms of open and close affects the pitch and also the volume of our voice. So again, the false vocal cords, they don't create sound, but they do help with that airway protection. All right, and that's it. Again, when we breathe, the vocal cords stay open. When we speak or when we swallow, the vocal cords close. So we already looked at images of the cartilages that make up the larynx, but this is just your slide that speaks on it. So again, we're talking about our voice box, the larynx. It's made up of 9 cartilages, and those cartilages are responsible for not only the structure but also the support of it. The cartilages are divided into what we call singles or single laryngeal cartilages, and then also paired groups, so meaning 2. All right, and again, they help us with breathing, they protect our sound, and then they also help with producing sound. So the single laryngeal cartilages, that means they're unpaired, are listed here. All right, the 3 largest ones are the thyroid cartilage. Again, that's the one that forms our Adam's apple and protects our vocal cords. We have the epiglottis. We described it as a leaf-shaped cartilage that acts like a lid or a cover for the trachea when we're swallowing, and that's going to prevent food and liquid from entering the airway. And then last but not least, for the single laryngeal cartilages, we have the cricoid cartilage, and that's the one that's ring shaped right below the thyroid cartilage that helps with the support, and it also connects the larynx to the trachea. In terms of the paired laryngeal cartilages, we have the arytenoid cartilage. In terms of its shape, we said it was pyramid in shape, and it controls the movement of our vocal cords. So it basically helps with our speech by opening and closing those vocal folds. All right, then we have the corniculate cartilages. We describe them as horn-like. They are small, and they sit on top of the arytenoid cartilages, and they again help with the movement of the vocal cords, and they also help support the larynx. All right, and then we have the cuneiform cartilages. In terms of their shape, they're rod-shaped cartilages, and they are embedded in the tissue of our larynx. So they help provide support and also structure to the laryngeal walls. So again, the larynx is made up of 9 cartilage, 3 single and 3 pairs. The thyroid, cricoid, and epiglottis which the epiglottis is the largest, makes up the Adam's apple. They're unpaired, and then we have the paired ones as well. And that is it for this slide. Now this is our last upper airway slide, and it's basically focusing on the muscles and also the functions of our larynx. So the larynx, again, it is made of cartilage, but we're not just talking about cartilage. It also has muscles, and the muscles control the movement and also the function of the larynx. So the muscles are divided into two groups: intrinsic muscles and also extrinsic muscles, and they're going to help with speech, they're going to help with breathing, and also airway protection. So in terms of our intrinsic muscles of the larynx, these are muscles that originate and also insert into the larynx. So some of their main functions include controlling the vocal fold length and tension, so basically adjusting the vocal cord tightness to change our pitch and tone. They do regulate the shape of the pharyngeal inlet, so basically helps control the airflow and the sound production. The opening and closing of the epiglottis, they do that as well. So between the vocal cords, the glottis is basically that opening between the vocal cords, and it allows for air to pass through. When we speak, again, the glottis narrows and closes, and to produce that sound, when we breathe, it opens so that it allows the air to go through to our lungs. In terms of the extrinsic muscles of the larynx, these muscles only have one attachment inside the larynx, and the other is on a different structure, like the hyoid bone or the skull. So the role that the extrinsic muscles play is to help move the entire larynx up and down. So it's going to be important for things like swallowing, speaking, and also breathing. In terms of larynx function, again, the larynx is responsible for airway protection. So it keeps food and liquids from entering the trachea. The epiglottis is what closes when we swallow, and that does prevent us from choking, whether it's on food or whether it's on liquid. It helps with breathing, so it forms part of the airway to the lungs, and it helps control that airflow. It also helps with the voice production. So we're talking about the vocal cords. They're going to vibrate when the air passes through them, and of course assists us with producing sound. All right, they also, in terms of the tension and the movement of intrinsic muscles, they help determine the pitch and also the loudness of our voice when we speak. So both intrinsic muscles and extrinsic muscles are important. Intrinsic muscles help control the vocal cord movement and sound production, and the extrinsic muscles help move the entire larynx and help us with swallowing and also speaking. So the larynx helps with not only protecting the airway, but also allowing that airflow in order for us to speak. All right, now we're moving on to learning objectives 6 through 9. Objective 6, describe the structures and functions of the trachea, bronchi, bronchioles, and alveoli. So now we're talking about the lower respiratory tract. Identify the lobes, bronchopulmonary segments, gross surface anatomy, and generalized functions of the lungs. Discuss the structures and functions of the thorax and mediastinum in respiration, and discuss disorders associated with the respiratory tract. All right, structure and function of the trachea. So the trachea, sometimes we call it the windpipe. It again is a structure that assists us in terms of our respiratory function. So it is the main airway that basically connects the larynx to our lungs. So it does help with breathing. All right, that's a critical role that it plays. All right, in terms of the structure, when we say location and length, the trachea extends from the larynx to the primary bronchi, so where it branches into our right and left lung. All right, it's about 4 to 5 inches or 10 to 12 centimeters long, and it's about 1 inch or 2.5 centimeters in diameter. All right, as far as the wall composition of our trachea, the tracheal walls have 3 layers. All right, we have the adventitia, or the outer layer. It's connective tissue that helps with the structural support. We have a smooth muscle layer, and C-shaped cartilage rings. That's the middle layer. So the cartilage rings keep the airway open. It prevents it from collapsing. The smooth muscle allows for flexibility and also movement. And then we have the inner layer, which is made of respiratory mucosa. So again, it's lined with that ciliated epithelium and also mucus producing cells that are responsible for trapping dust, bacteria, and other particles before it enters the lungs. That cilia is the fine hair-like particles that are going to move that mucus upward towards the throat and help keep the airway clear. All right, in terms of the posterior tracheal wall, all right, which we are right here, it contains what we call elastic fibers, and those fibers help provide flexibility. All right, it does, with the posterior tracheal wall, it does not have cartilage, so it allows our esophagus to expand slightly into the trachea when we swallow food. In terms of what we mean by incomplete C-shaped cartilage rings, these are the rings that are open in the back, and that's going to allow that trachea to expand and contract when we need it to. So again, it allows for that esophagus to expand when we're swallowing food. So in terms of tracheal function, or trachea function, it provides us with an open airway. So it's the place for air to flow, to travel from our throat to our lungs. It does have, it is composed of structures that filter and protect to keep harmful agents out of our lungs. So we have mucus, and we also have cilia, and that traps those harmful particles and moves them out of the airway to prevent us from getting some type of infection. Flexibility, it is flexible for swallowing. So the elastic posterior wall and also those C-shaped rings, they allow for the esophagus to expand when we swallow large amounts of food. All right, so again, the trachea is the main airway. It basically transports air to our lungs. All right, now we're looking at a cross section of our trachea. So we're basically showing you the inner layers that we just discussed, and also some other internal structures that are located in the trachea. So again, we know that the trachea is part of the respiratory system, and it allows the air that we breathe in to go from our throat down to our lungs. So one of the items in this cross section is the lumen of the trachea. So that's an open space on the inside of the trachea that allows the air to flow. So it's lined with mucous membrane, all right, the mucus coat, all right, and that membrane traps dust, bacteria, and other particles, not allowing it to enter into our lungs. So it traps it. It also keeps our airway moist. Not shown here on this picture, but know that we have that tiny cilia, the hair-like structures. They move that mucus and trap particles up towards the throat for removal. So sometimes when we cough and it's a productive cough, that's us getting that mucus out. All right, next we have the tracheal rings, or the hyaline cartilage. All right, that is the reinforced C-shaped rings of the cartilage that help keep the airway open. And the rings also prevent the trachea for collapsing, but allowing for that flexibility and movement. All right, so that's the cartilage. All right, as you can see, it's a C shape. All right, and then we have the smooth muscle, so the trachealis muscle. All right, it's here, and we can see that we're in a different layer. It's located basically in the back part of the trachea, so in the posterior portion of the trachea. And it connects the open ends of that C-shaped cartilage ring. As you can see, it connects the open ends of it right here. All right, this muscle contracts to make our airway smaller. For instance, if we need to cough, and it relaxes to allow for us to breathe easier. So that's the job of the muscle. Then we have the annular or tracheal ligament here. All right, and it's basically a connective tissue that helps hold the cartilage rings together. So it provides it with stability while again still allowing for that flexibility and movement. All right, then we have the adventitia layer. So that's the outermost layer of the trachea, again made of connective tissue, and it helps attach the trachea to surrounding structures that are located in our neck and also our chest area. So basically, in terms of function of the trachea based on the structures, all right, we have airway support. That hyaline cartilage, those rings help keep the trachea open for that air movement. Mucus production and filtration, we have those mucus glands in the cilia working together to trap and remove harmful substances before they can reach our lungs. Flexibility for swallowing, we have that trachealis muscle and also the open cartilage rings. It allows the esophagus, which is behind the trachea, to expand when we need to swallow, especially when we're talking about swallowing food. All right, and then of course, in terms of our cough reflex, we have that trachealis muscle. It contracts when we're coughing, forcing air out forcefully to clear the airway, and of course, it relaxes during normal breathing. All right, here we're looking at another cross section of the trachea, but we're kind of looking at the relationship between the trachea and the esophagus, and basically how they interact when we're breathing versus when we're swallowing. So again, the trachea is what allows air to pass through, so it's our airway, and the esophagus allows for food to pass through. And again, they're closely positioned side by side, and again, their structures allow them to function efficiently without interfering with each other. So in terms of breathing versus swallowing, so let's look at this image on the left first. So the trachea, when we're breathing, as you can see, it remains open, and it allows the air to flow freely into our lungs. The esophagus is collapsed, all right, and the reason why it's collapsed is because no food is passing through, or no food needs to pass through. In terms of those C-shaped cartilage rings in the trachea, again, they provide that support that we need in terms of the support to keep the airway open. All right, now if we're looking at the image on the right, this is us now swallowing. Here we're breathing, now we're swallowing, potentially swallowing food. So as you can see, the esophagus expands, all right, and that's going to accommodate that food or liquid and allow it to pass through. The trachea will slightly narrow, as you can see the arrows going up, but the airway is still going to remain functional due to the fact that the trachealis muscle is flexible. That's the muscle that's in the back of the trachea. All right, the epiglottis, which we don't see it right here, it would cover the trachea at this point, and that's going to prevent us from choking or aspirating food or liquid into the esophagus. So again, the epiglottis is not here, but it would cover the trachea during this point in time. So again, the trachea, that's our airway. It stays open during breathing, and it can slightly narrow during what we call the swallowing process due to the fact that that trachealis muscle is flexible. All right, the esophagus, which is the food passageway, it's normally collapsed when we're breathing. All right, so it doesn't need to be open because we don't have food or liquid going through there. So in terms of this cervical vertebrae that we see here on the bottom, it does provide us with support for both the trachea and also the epiglottis. So it helps maintain alignment for our airway and also our digestive tract. So the spine is what we're talking about here. Now, the reason why it's important for the trachea and the esophagus to work together, that's one, to ensure that we can breathe appropriately and also ensure that we can digest our food appropriately, or that process can run smooth. So those C-shaped cartilage rings that we're talking about, again, they keep the trachea open for airflow. And then the soft posterior wall of the trachea is going to allow for the esophagus to expand when it needs to when we're swallowing food. Again, if food accidentally enters the trachea instead of the esophagus, this is the reason why that happens is because the epiglottis did not close appropriately. So the epiglottis, which again we said is not pictured here, it's supposed to close the trachea so that food and liquid can't be aspirated. So again, if we accidentally get food or some sort of beverage into the trachea, that's when we say that we're kind of choking and that coughing reflex kicks in, and we're coughing so that we can cough that liquid or that food or clear it from the trachea or clear it from the airway. So again, during breathing, the trachea is open, the esophagus remains collapsed. During swallowing, the esophagus expands. The trachea is slightly narrower to accommodate for that food movement, but again, the epiglottis is going to close down so that we don't aspirate any food. One thing that is, I guess, a fun fact, if we're talking about if you've ever had the hiccups, that occurs or happens because the diaphragm is contracting involuntarily, and it causes a sudden intake of air while that epiglottis closes, creating that hiccup sound. All right, we're looking at the respiratory mucosa again. This is the lining that's in our airways, and it's responsible for protecting our lungs by filtering out things such as dust, pathogens, and other particles. So these are two microscopic views of the respiratory mucosa. On the left, image A, it's a tissue sample that we're looking at with the microscope, looking at the different layers, and image B on the right, we're using or viewing it via a scanning electron microscope. All right, so it's showing more so the surface details of the cilia and also the goblet cells. So some of the key structures and as well as their functions on image A, we're looking at the pseudo-stratified epithelium again. That's the tissue where the cells are layered and they're actually all connected to the basement membrane. They provide a strong but flexible lining for the airway. The goblet cells, again, they produce mucus, which traps dust, bacteria, and other harmful particles so that they cannot enter our lungs. And we have the cilia again, motile cilia, so trying hair-like structures that move the mucus upward towards the throat, where it can either be swallowed at that point or it can be expelled, meaning we cough it up. They call it a mucociliary escalator. So basically that process of bringing that mucus back up. The basement membrane, as you can see, that's your foundation layer of epithelium that anchors the cells in place. All right, so it basically supports the tissue. All right, the submucosa, that's the deeper layer, and it contains blood vessels, nerves, and also additional support structures to maintain our tissue health and also the function of the tissue. On the right, again, that's electron microscope view. So we can see the motile cilia again. Those are those hair-like projections. You can see them clearly because they're magnified. And these basically, in a coordinated fashion, they move the mucus as well as any other trapped particles out of the airway. The goblet cells, of course, they're mucus-producing cells. They're round, dark, those round, dark structures that we see there that are in the presence of the cilia. They secrete mucus as well, which traps the particles that enter our airway before they can reach our lungs. So again, the importance of the respiratory mucosa is it's one of our first lines of defense. So that mucus is responsible for trapping dust, bacteria, viruses, etc., whatever enters our airway to prevent it from reaching the lungs. It's considered to be a self-cleaning system. So the cilia are continuously moving that mucus upward to clear our airway. So again, that mucociliary escalator. Another thing that it does is it prevents dryness. So the mucosa keeps the airway moist. It also prevents irritation and damage from anything that we inhale, to include the air. All right, now we're going to talk about the structure of the bronchi. So the trachea, also known as our windpipe, it basically splits into two tubes, and those two tubes are called the primary bronchi, and they're responsible for directing the air that we breathe in into each of the lungs. So the bronchi also branch into smaller airways, eventually leading to our air sacs where that gas exchange happens. So in terms of the structure of the bronchi, the primary main bronchi, again, the trachea divides into those two primary bronchi at the carina. All right, and the carina is a ridge of cartilage at the bottom of the trachea. All right, the right primary bronchus is wider as well as shorter, and it's more vertical, making it more likely for foreign objects to get stuck in it. The left primary bronchus is narrower and more horizontal because it passes around our heart. So the bronchi themselves, they enter the right and left lungs and they begin branching. We also have the secondary or lobar bronchi. So each primary bronchus divides into secondary bronchi, which correspond to the lobes of the lungs. So in terms of the right lung, we have 3 secondary bronchi, 1 for each lobe. And for the left lung, we have 2 secondary bronchi, 1 for each lobe. We also have tertiary or segmental bronchi. The secondary bronchi further divide into what we call the tertiary bronchi, and they're responsible for supplying specific regions of each of the lungs. All right, then we have the bronchioles. All right, and bronchioles, they're the tertiary bronchi branch into each bronchi, which are smaller airways that don't have cartilage. And these bronchioles basically regulate airflow by expanding or constricting. All right, we also have alveolar ducts and alveoli. So the bronchioles lead to alveolar ducts, which end in the alveoli, which are the tiny air sacs where gas exchange occur. So oxygen moves from the alveoli into the blood, and carbon dioxide is expelled. That's where the gas exchange occurs. All right, so the key takeaways for this slide is the trachea splits into 2 primary bronchi, 1 for each lung. Those bronchi continue branching eventually leading to our alveoli where oxygen and carbon dioxide are exchanged. The right bronchus is more vertical and wider, making it more prone for blockages from inhaled objects, and the bronchioles control airflow before reaching the alveoli. All right, now we're looking at a plastic cast of the air spaces in our lungs. So some of the key features that are seen here, the trachea is the yellow tube at the top. All right, that's central. All right, the main airway that carries air from our mouth and nose into the lungs. As you can see, it divides into right and left bronchi, and they would enter each lung. Of course, the lungs themselves are not there, but you can see that this is kind of the shape of the lung here. All right, primary, secondary, and tertiary bronchi are the yellow and green structures. So the primary bronchi again split into secondary lobar bronchi, which supply each of our lung lobes. And the tertiary bronchi divide further to supply the smaller regions of the lungs. Again, these divisions basically ensure that air is distributed evenly throughout our lungs. All right, the bronchioles, those are the smaller branches that are in red and black. They're more flexible, and again earlier we said that they don't have cartilage, so they control airflow and also distribution of oxygen to our alveoli. The alveolar ducts as well as the alveoli, those are the finer black branches at the ends, and those structures are basically the endpoints for the respiratory system. So the alveoli are the small air sacs where gas exchange occurs, oxygen enters the blood, and carbon dioxide, of course, is removed in those sacs. So again, these are the structures that make it possible for oxygen exchange to occur. Now we're moving on to the structure of the alveoli. Again, alveoli are the tiny air sacs in the lungs where gas exchange occurs. So basically it allows the oxygen to enter the blood and of course the carbon dioxide to be expelled. So two terms that are important for this slide are the respiratory membrane and of course surfactant. So the respiratory membrane is a thin barrier that allows the gases to move between the air sacs or the alveoli, and also our capillaries, or basically our blood vessels. All right, it consists of three layers. We have the alveolar epithelium. All right, that's a thin wall of the alveolus made of what we consider simple squamous cells, and it allows for easy gas diffusion. We also have the capillary endothelium, so the inner lining of the blood vessels surrounding the alveolus, and then we have the joined basement membrane. So those are thin layers that fuse the alveolar and the capillary walls. Basically, it reduces the distance that the gases need to travel. The reason why this is important, the membrane is extremely thin. It's about 0.5 microns thick, and that makes gas exchange fast and also consistent. So oxygen moves from the alveoli into the capillaries, while carbon dioxide moves from the blood into the alveoli to be exhaled. In terms of what surfactant is, that is a lipid-based fluid that coats the inner surface of our alveoli. So it serves two major functions for us. It reduces surface tension, meaning it prevents the alveoli from collapsing when we exhale, and it also helps the lungs expand easily. So it makes breathing more efficient, basically by reducing the effort that we need to make in order to inflate the alveoli. So if you've ever, so surfactant in terms of, let's say premature babies, sometimes they lack the surfactant, so it makes it very difficult for them to breathe. So um, those babies may have a condition called neonatal respiratory distress syndrome, all right, and it requires surfactant treatment to basically help them breathe. So again, the key takeaways here: the respiratory membrane is a thin barrier that allows that oxygen and carbon dioxide exchange between the lungs and the blood. And surfactant basically prevents our alveolar from collapsing, and it makes it easy for us to breathe. All right. It also allows for um, gas exchange because of the thinness of the membrane and also the presence of that surfactant. All right, this slide discusses the function of the bronchi and the alveoli. So, of course, they are again part of our respiratory system, and they ensure that the air that we breathe is properly distributed and oxygen, of course, is transferred to the blood. So, three key functions that the bronchi and the alveoli serve are air distribution, gas exchange, and also airway purification. So in terms of air distribution, this is a bronchi function. So the bronchi serve as the main air passageway for our lungs or into our lungs, and they divide into smaller and smaller branches as they continue into the lungs, and they ultimately lead to the alveoli. So there's 23 levels of branching, ensuring that the oxygen is delivered efficiently to every part of our lungs. And those branching surfaces, they are basically there to maximize the surface area for that gas exchange. In terms of gas exchange, that's an alveoli function. So the alveoli, we're talking about those tiny air sacs again. That's where oxygen enters the blood and also carbon dioxide is removed. So as we said earlier, they have thin walls that allow for the rapid diffusion of the gases, and the capillaries surrounding the alveoli carry oxygenated blood to the body and remove carbon dioxide when we exhale. Last but not least, we have the mucus blanket. So that's basically airway protection and also purification. So the mucus blanket is a protective layer that covers the entire respiratory tract. So it helps trap dust, bacteria, and other particles, basically preventing them from reaching the lungs. Again, it consists of cilia, that's the tiny hair-like structures in the bronchi, and it's responsible for moving mucus upward, allowing it to be either coughed out or swallowed. So again, that's part of that mucociliary escalator system we talked about earlier. So key takeaways: the bronchi distribute air throughout the lungs, branching 23 times before reaching the alveoli. And the alveoli are responsible for oxygen and carbon dioxide exchange. The mucus blanket acts as our filtering system, so it basically keeps the lungs clean and free from harmful particles. All right, this slide focuses on the structure of the lungs. So the lungs are the main organs that are responsible for respiration. So we're talking about oxygenating our blood and also removing the carbon dioxide. In terms of their shape, they're cone shaped, and they also have some distinct features that aid in the way that they function. So the cone-shaped structure of the lungs basically extends from the diaphragm, which is the bottom part, to just above the clavicles. That's where the top part begins. And they're protected by our rib cage. So the lungs are enclosed in our rib cage. They have what are considered to be a spongy, elastic texture, and that allows for them to expand and contract when we breathe. All right, there's another structure called the hilum, and that's a slit or an opening on the medial or middle surface of each lung. All right, and this is the entry and exit point for the primary bronchi, which carry air in and out, the pulmonary arteries, which bring oxygen pour blood to the lungs, and also the pulmonary veins, which carry oxygen-rich blood back to the heart. All right, in terms of the base of the lung, the inferior surface, or the bottom portion of the lung, it rests on the diaphragm. So when we breathe in, the diaphragm contracts and flattens, allowing for the lungs to expand downward. All right, the last, well, no, not the last, because we have two more. So the apex of the lungs, that's the pointed upper margin of each lung, and we'll look at a visual in a couple slides, and it's located just above our clavicles. The right lung's apex is slightly lower than the left one due to the way that the liver is positioned. All right, and then last but not least, we have the costal surface. So that's the outer surface of the lungs that lies against the ribs. So the ribs are responsible for protecting our lungs, but it does allow for the lungs to expand and also contract when we breathe. So the key takeaways here are the lungs are cone shaped and they extend from the diaphragm up to the clavicles. The hilum is the entry and exit point for airways and blood vessels. And the base of the lung rests on the diaphragm while the apex extends above the clavicle. The costal surface, again, is the portion that's in contact with our ribs. And the ribs, of course, protect and support our lungs, but it does allow for them to expand and contract. One more thing to note about the right lung. The right lung is a little bit larger than the left lung, and that's because the heart takes up space on the left side of the chest, and this is called the cardiac notch. All right, now we're moving on to the lobes of the lungs and also lung function. So the lungs are divided into lobes, and the lobes basically help distribute air, and also they facilitate that gas exchange that we need. So the left and the right lungs, they're not identical in terms of structure, and the reason for that is because of the position of the heart that we talked about earlier. So the lobes of the lungs, in terms of the left lung, is divided into two lobes. So it has a superior lobe and also an inferior lobe. All right, the left lung is smaller than the right lobe, and that's due to the cardiac notch that we talked about earlier, which is an indentation where the heart sits. All right, the right lung is divided into three lobes. We have the superior, middle, and inferior lobe. So the right lung is larger than the left lobe. The right lung is larger than the left lung, and that's because the heart is positioned slightly to the left, which we learn in our heart chapter. All right, in terms of segments, we have the bronchopulmonary segments. Each lobe is divided into bronchopulmonary segments. So these are small units, they call them functional units of the lung. So the segments allow for airflow, and also each lung area is allowed to operate independently. So we call it targeted airflow. All right, we also have the visceral pleura. All right, and that's a thin membrane that covers the lung surfaces. It's part of the pleural membrane, which also includes the parietal pleura, which is the lining of our chest cavity. All right, the space between these layers contains what we call pleural fluid, and pleural fluid reduces friction, and it also helps our lungs expand more smoothly when we're breathing. All right, so functions of the lungs: air distribution. Basically, the bronchi and their branching structures are going to direct air evenly throughout the lungs. We have gas exchange. Oxygen is from what we inhale enters the bloodstream in the alveoli, and the carbon dioxide from the blood is exhaled through that same process. So key takeaways: the left lung has two lobes while the right lung has three. In terms of the bronchopulmonary segments, they allow for airflow distribution, and the visceral pleura covers the lungs and helps reduce friction during breathing. Last but not least, the lung's primary function is air distribution and also gas exchange. All right, now we're going to look at the lobes and the segments of the lungs. So again, the lungs are divided into lobes as well as segments. All right, and those divisions help better distribute air, and also it optimizes the gas exchange that we need. All right, so we're first going to take a look at the right lung, which is on this side. All right, and then we'll take a look at the left lung. All right, so the right lung has 3 lobes. We have a superior lobe right here, and it's located at the top of the right lung and is separated from the middle lobe, which is right here in green, by what we call a horizontal fissure. All right, this line right here. All right, the middle lobe, right middle lobe, is right here in green. Of course, we don't have a middle lobe on the left side, and it's located between the superior and the inferior lobes, and it's separated from the inferior lobe by what we call an oblique fissure. Oblique fissure is here. All right, the right inferior lobe, which is the lower lobe, all right, this red region right here, it's considered to be the largest of the 3 lobes, and it sits at the bottom of the right lung. All right, moving over to the left lung. All right, the left lung only has 2 lobes. We have the upper lobe here, and of course we have the lower lobe here, and it's separated by an oblique fissure, which is here. All right, the inferior lobe is considered to be the largest lobe of the left lung. All right, and it functions similar to the right inferior lobe. All right, so again, some of the key anatomical features. Only the right lung separates the superior and middle lobes, of course, because there's no middle lobe in the left lung. All right, the oblique fissure is located in both lungs, and it separates the superior and the inferior lobes. All right, in terms of the primary bronchi, which are basically the right and left primary bronchi, those again are the main airways that enter each of our lungs. And we can see them here, primary bronchus. All right, we also can somewhat see the sternum and the ribs. So the sternum, which is the center portion right here, if you've ever practiced or seen CPR, that's the portion that we push on. The sternum, basically it has a manubrium, which is the upper portion. We have the body, and of course we have the xiphoid process. All right, and that is basically, it helps provide protection for the lungs. That's the sternum as well as the ribs. All right, in terms of the function of the lobes and the segments, again, each lung lobe is divided into what we call smaller bronchopulmonary segments, and they, in terms of their function, they function independently. All right, they help to optimize our airflow, and they assist in ensuring that the lungs don't collapse. So if one segment is damaged, of course, the lung can still function because they operate independently. All right, so the key takeaways from this slide, the right lung has 3 lobes, the left lung has 2. And the reason why the left lobe only has 2, because we need to accommodate the heart. The horizontal and the oblique fissures separate the lobes. And the lungs, again, they're structured in a way that they can efficiently help us distribute air and also maximize that gas exchange. All right, we're still looking at the lobes and also the segments of the lungs. And this is a little bit more of a detailed breakdown so that we can see the bronchopulmonary segments that each lung has. So again, each lung lobe is divided into their own independent functional units called bronchopulmonary segments. So basically these segments, they receive their own air from their own tertiary bronchi or segmental bronchi, and they also have their own blood supply. So it allows for more targeted ventilation, meaning if one segment is damaged, then the other ones can still function properly. So our lungs won't deflate just because one section is damaged. As you can see in the right lung, there are 10 total segments. All right, in the superior lobe, there's 3 segments that's highlighted in purple. They're called the apical segment, the posterior segment, and the anterior segment. In the middle lobe, there's 2 segments highlighted in green, the lateral segment and the medial segment. And in the inferior lobe, there's 5 segments. The superior segment, medial basal, which is a cardiac segment, the anterior basal segment, the lateral basal segment, and also the posterior basal segment. In the left lung, the superior lobe has 4 segments. Sometimes, well, it says that the left lung segments can total 8 to 10. So even though I said 4 segments, what's featured here is 5 segments. We have the apico-posterior segments, 1 and 2 combined. We have in the left lung, of course, those segments 1 and 2, they're often fused together. That's why it says 8 to 10. We have the anterior segment, the superior lingular segment, and also the inferior lingular segment, which is the lower portion. All right, in the inferior lobe, there's also 4 to 5 segments that's highlighted in red. We have the superior segment, the medial basal or cardiac segment. We also have that one is sometimes absent because of the heart. We also have the anterior basal segment, the lateral basal segment, and the posterior basal segment. So again, the reason why the numbers fluctuate are because of fusion and or absence of some of the segments. So the reason why these bronchopulmonary segments are important is because they function independently, meaning if there's a diseased or damaged segment, it can be removed without affecting the other segment. So again, each segment has its own airway and also its own blood supply. So it makes, if we needed to target an individual segment and remove it, it doesn't affect the other segment. So again, the segments improve our airflow and they function independently of each other. So the key takeaways, the right lung has 10 segments. The left lung has 8 to 10 segments, again, because some of the segments are fused or, of course, missing. In terms of the lingula in the left lung, it is functionally similar to the middle lobe of the right lung, and of course each segment has its own airway and also its own blood supply, allowing each segment to operate independently. All right, so structure and function of the thorax. So we're basically now talking about the chest cavity, and the chest cavity, of course, houses our lungs, our heart, and also some of our major blood vessels. So it does play a role in breathing in terms of inspiration and expiration, and also a huge role in protecting our vital organs. So the thoracic cavity itself is divided into different regions. All right, so in terms of the structure and divisions, the thoracic cavity is divided into 3 compartments, and of course it's separated by what we call a pleura. So we have 2 pleural cavities, each containing a lung, and then of course we have the mediastinum, which is the central compartment. So the pleural divisions, the pleura is considered to be a double layered membrane that surrounds the lungs, and it contains pleural fluid, which reduces friction when we breathe. We also have the visceral pleura, which covers the lungs, and we have the parietal pleura, which lines our thoracic cavity. All right, the mediastinum, or the central area, central space, is the area between the lungs, and it contains the heart and the pericardium, so basically the heart's protective membrane. It contains the esophagus, which we talked about earlier. That's where food passes. It also contains the trachea and the major airways, as well as large blood vessels like the aorta, the vena cava, and also some of the pulmonary arteries and veins. So the function of the thorax is basically to help with respiration, which is breathing. The rib cage and the diaphragm will expand and contract as we allow, or as we breathe, meaning we allow for that air to move. In terms of inspiration, the diaphragm is going to contract and the chest is going to expand, allowing us to pull air in. And in terms of expiration, the diaphragm is going to relax, allowing us to breathe out or push the air out. All right, again, a major job of this thorax is to protect our vital organs like our heart, our lungs, and also major blood vessels. So key takeaways here. The thoracic cavity, it is divided into three compartments, two pleural cavities and the mediastinum. The pleura helps protect the lungs and it allows us to breathe smoothly. The mediastinum contains the heart, the esophagus, the trachea, and some of the major blood vessels. And the thorax, of course, helps with breathing. All right, it allows for us to breathe in and breathe out. And the more medical terminology terms are inspiration and expiration. All right, so the last couple slides, we're going to focus on some of the disorders that are associated with our respiratory tract. So again, our respiratory system is always going to be exposed to the environment. So it does make it vulnerable to infections, inflammation, and also some more structural abnormalities. So we're going to look at some of the major categories of respiratory disorders. We're going to look at inflammatory and infectious conditions as well as some of the structural disorders. So the first ones we're going to look at are in terms of inflammation and infection. So rhinitis. All right, rhinitis is inflammation of our nasal mucosa. It's commonly caused by things like allergies, colds, and also infections. Some of the symptoms that are related to rhinitis, the person might have runny nose, they might sneeze or have bouts of sneezing, nasal congestion, and also postnasal drip. The next one is pharyngitis. That's a fancy name for sore throat. So inflammation of the pharynx, which is considered the throat. And this one can often be due to viral or bacterial infections. So symptoms of sore throat, of course, are sore throat. And some people might have difficulty swallowing, and it might be accompanied by a fever, depending on what caused it. All right, next we have laryngitis. All right, inflammation of the larynx, the voice box, and that one's often due to either overuse or some type of infection. So if you yell a lot or you sing a lot, you might have laryngitis one day. All right, symptoms of laryngitis are hoarseness, loss of voice, sore throat, and also dry cough. All right, in terms of inflammation, the last one is tonsillitis. Infection and inflammation of the tonsils. This one's typically caused by bacteria or viruses, and the symptoms would be swollen tonsils, sore throat, fever, and also you might see white patches on the patient's tonsils. All right, in terms of anatomical disorders or structural disorders, the first one is deviated septum. So that's displacement of the nasal septum. All right, again, the nasal septum should divide the nose evenly. With this one, it causes for unequal airflow through the nostrils because it's displaced. It's not evenly sitting where it should. If a person has this, they might have difficulty breathing through one of their nostrils. They might have frequent sinus infections, and they also might snore. And the treatment for this one typically would be surgery, septoplasty, and it may be needed if it's a really severe case. All right, the next one is sleep apnea. So that's a condition where the breathing will temporarily stop while the person is sleeping, and that's due to an airway blockage. All right, some of the symptoms for this one are snoring, headaches, pauses in breathing while they're sleeping, and also daytime fatigue because they don't get a restful sleep. Some of the risk factors for sleep apnea are obesity, enlarged tonsils, and also some of those structural issues in the airway. Treatment for sleep apnea might be a CPAP machine, also lifestyle changes, and or surgery. All right, the next one is epistaxis or nosebleed, bleeding from the nasal cavity. It can be caused by dry air, especially when it's really hot, or you like turn your heat on in the winter. Trauma or of course high blood pressure can cause this as well. Treatment would be basically applying pressure, using a humidifier in rooms, especially when the heat is on, or cauterization if the cases are severe. All right, so again, the key takeaways here in terms of infections and inflammation, rhinitis, pharyngitis, laryngitis, tonsillitis, all can cause discomfort and also breathing difficulties. In terms of our structural abnormalities, we have deviated septum, sleep apnea, epistaxis, all can affect airflow and may require some type of medical intervention. And sleep apnea, that one is a serious condition that can lead to some other long-term health complications, including high blood pressure and also heart disease if it's left untreated. All right, now this is our last topic of the day, disorders of the lower respiratory tract. So the lower respiratory tract includes our trachea, the bronchi, and also the bronchioles, as well as the lungs. So again, these disorders affect the regions that can impact our breathing, also the oxygen exchange, and also lung function. So three common lower respiratory infections, um, as well as lung cancer, are what we're going to look at here. So, and lung cancer, of course, is a serious disease, as well as these others that affect the lung tissue. So, in terms of lower respiratory infections, the first we're going to look at is acute bronchitis. So, that's an inflammation of the bronchial tubes. It's often caused by viral or bacterial infections. And symptoms for the patient would be a persistent cough, often with mucus, wheezing, chest discomfort, and also fever. Treatment for acute bronchitis, of course, for the patient would be rest, fluids, cough medications to help with the cough, and also sometimes antibiotics if it's bacterial. All right, the next one is pneumonia. So that's infection of the alveoli, the air sacs within the lungs. They're going to fill with fluid or pus. All right, it's caused by bacteria, typically Streptococcus pneumoniae, which again is a virus. It also can be caused by a fungi. COVID-19 can cause this, and also the flu can also lead to this as well. Symptoms would be shortness of breath, chest pain, fever, coughing, and also phlegm. For treatment purposes, the patient would be, especially if it's a bacterial pneumonia, they would receive antibiotics. If it's viral, they would receive antivirals, and sometimes they may need oxygen therapy if the case is really severe. All right, next we have TB or tuberculosis. That's a bacterial infection caused by Mycobacterium tuberculosis that primarily affects the lungs, but it can spread to other organs. It is considered in terms of transmission purposes as it's airborne disease, so it's basically spread through coughs and also sneezes. Symptoms for the patient might be a chronic cough, sometimes with blood. They might also experience night sweats, weight loss, and also fatigue. So this one is contagious. Treatment would be long-term antibiotics, typically 6 months or more of multiple medications. All right, next And last, we're moving on to lung cancer. So basically, we're talking about an uncontrolled cell growth in the lung tissue, and it can damage the alveoli and also the airways. Some of the types that we can have are non-small cell lung cancer, which is the most common type. Often that one is caused by smoking or linked to smoking rather. And then we can have small cell lung cancer. That one is an aggressive one and it spreads really quickly. So in terms of the effects on the lungs, it's going to destroy those gas exchange surfaces. So it's going to reduce our ability to absorb that oxygen. Lung cancer can also spread, so it can metastasize to other organs. In terms of treatment, if we have lung cancer, surgery can be effective for more localized tumors. So before they metastasize, before they spread. The patient might also need to receive chemotherapy and radiation, as well as some other targeted therapies that may be needed in more advanced cases. So the key takeaways here in terms of lower respiratory infections, we have bronchitis, pneumonia, and TB, and they can all cause serious breathing problems. Pneumonia and TB are the leading causes of what we consider lung-related deaths worldwide. Lung cancer damages lung tissue, and of course it has a high mortality rate. So especially if the patient is diagnosed late and it started to metastasize. So the key when it comes to lung cancer is early detection. All right, that's going to improve the survival rates because if it's localized and you can have surgery, that's going to be the most effective during the early stages, and then they can follow up with, of course, chemotherapy and radiation therapy to target and kill anything that remains in the event that you can have that surgery. All right, so one thing to consider or to note is that smoking is considered to be the leading cause of lung cancer, but sadly enough, non-smokers can also develop it, and that's due to things such as air pollution, radon exposure, genetics. So there's some other environmental things to include occupational things that can cause lung cancer. So this concludes our lecture on the respiratory tract. If you have any questions or need clarification on any of the topics, please feel free to reach out to me. Thank you.